right, good afternoon, everybody. The title of my talk is wrong, by the way. I'm not talking about leading Africa's wildlife economies. So and here's my clicker. Okay, so yeah, great to be here, and I hope you're enjoying Fuse so far. From what I understand, everyone here in this audience is involved in the travel industry. So I'm going to talk to you about something that hopefully is relevant to your work beyond wildlife, because some of you, obviously, I'm sure in being in travel, one of the things that you market the most is Africa's wildlife. But there's more to Africa than wildlife, isn't there? And so I want to talk to you about the bigger picture in Africa. So I'm from Ghana originally, as was mentioned, but I've lived and worked in about 10 different countries in Africa. So I left Ghana when I was 4, and then I went to Gambia until I was 8. Then I went to Botswana until I was 12. Then I went to Zimbabwe until I was 16. So every 4 years I moved to a different place. Then I went to college in the States. I moved to South Africa. I lived here until 4 years ago. Then I went to Mauritius. I lived in Mauritius for 4 years, and now I'm living in Nairobi. So I'm an African. And so as a result, I'm always thinking about Africa and its place in the world and where we're going and so forth. And when I think, I go back to 1,000 years. And I think about how the world has evolved over that time. So when you study history, you realize for the first 600 years of that period, what happened in the world was pretty much defined by what happened in Europe, right? So you went through, the period of the Enlightenment, and then you had the Renaissance period where Leonardo da Vinci and Descartes and all these people came up with all these ideas, the Medici family, Michelangelo, etc., right? And then, go all the way until the Industrial Revolution. But pretty much what happened in Europe. And then, of course, they defined the world by going out and colonizing the whole world, right? So Europe was the power. France, Italy, Spain, that's where a lot of things were happening. Portugal, etc. And then you go to about 300 years ago, now you see the rise of the United States, right? That they become the most powerful, most influential part of the world, and the colonial powers start dying down, and they become less and less influential. And then you go to like 100 years ago, and you start to see the rise of Asia, right? So Japan was the first one, and then they were followed by Korea and Singapore and Thailand, etc. And then more recently, you see China and India rising, right? So that's kind of how history has evolved over the last 1,000 years, all the way up to this century. Now, my belief is that this century is going to be the African century. This is the century where progress in the world is going to be defined by what happens here. And let me tell you why. By the end of this century, 40% of the entire world will be African. 40% of the world's population is going to be in Africa. Right? So whether we like it or not, the future of the world is going to be driven by what happens in Africa. Because if 40% of the world's population is in Africa, where Africa goes is where the world is going to go. So this is the African century. Now the only question we have to answer, is it going to be a good century or a bad century? But it will be the African century, right, for the entire world. And so I think a lot about, if this is going to be a defining century for the world, what are some of the challenges and what are some of the opportunities that we have as a continent? Now, we have a lot of challenges, right? I have this list that I came up with once called the 7 grand challenges of Africa. These are the big problems that we need to solve. Urbanization. There are 800 million people who are going to move into African cities in the next 40 years. Can you imagine how challenging that's going to be? We have to think about housing for all these people, sanitation, urban planning, architecture, all these challenges to build livable cities in Africa. Education is another huge problem. We have the fastest growing population in the world, It's also the youngest population in the world. The average age of an African is 19.5, compared to an average age of a German or Japanese, 47, right? So 200 million people between the age of 15 and 24, and that's growing, and they need education. Infrastructure, we need to build ports and figure out how we're going to bring energy to people in Africa, and transportation, all that stuff. Healthcare, climate change. Africa is going to be the continent that's going to be most affected by climate change. Governance, we all know about that, right? Jacob Zuma. Robert Mugabe. This has been a big problem in Africa, right? And then finally, job creation. Do you know that by 2035, Africa is going to have the largest workforce in the world? Larger than China, larger than India. 1 billion people will need jobs on this continent. And if you convert that, 2035 seems far away, right? But I like to think of it in terms of days. Last year, we had 6,000 days before we had to create 1 billion jobs. Now, this year, we have 5,700 or something, right? But work backwards from year 2035 to today, we've got less than 6,000 days till we have the largest workforce in the world. So we have lots of challenges, right? But we also have great opportunities. There's another list, what I call the 7 great opportunities. And these are low-hanging fruit where Africa has just been blessed. And we have no excuse than to be world-class in these areas, right? We have unusual competitive advantage in agriculture. This continent has the largest amount of arable land that has yet been cultivated. Plenty of rain, plenty of sunshine. Yet we spend about $40 billion importing food into Africa where we have perfect conditions to grow. This is complete ridiculous. We should be one of the world's leaders in agriculture. And as the world grows from 6 billion to 9 billion, we're going to feed the rest of the world if we can just get our act together, right? Natural resources. We have plenty of gold and diamond and minerals. I remember when I was growing up in Botswana, there was a mining town, Selebipikwe, that I lived in. And we went for a tour when I was about 11 to the mine. And they showed us all this ore that's dug up out of the ground. I said, what happens to this ore? So we send it to Norway. And I said, what happens after that? They refine it, and then we send it next door to Zimbabwe at 10 times the price. It's like ridiculous. Why are we sending all we have all this gold and oil, and we need to do much. The arts, the culture, and the design. I think that's a huge opportunity for Africa. Because we're great storytellers in Africa, right? And the nice thing about this, the world is now hungry for content. Netflix is producing all this stuff. Apple's TV, everyone is going into content. And they need creative ideas. Yet they keep making the same old movies in the US. Every year, again. Batman 10, Fast and Furious. I'm like, come on, guys. Let's get our act together and use what we are naturally good at. And the good thing about arts, it doesn't require much capital. It just requires your brain power, right? Creativity. Let's tell those stories. So that's a good opportunity. Tourism, that's what you guys do. Huge untapped opportunity. Massive, massive untapped. Where I come from, Ghana, we have these slave castles that people from there's about 200 million people who are in the African diaspora who have gone to Brazil and the USA and everything, who are taken as slaves. They all want to come back and see the slave castles. But when you go to Cape Coast in Ghana, there isn't even a decent hotel you can stay at. Right across from the castle. I'm like, come on, guys. Huge untapped opportunity all across Africa to just get hospitality to a whole new level, right? And the good thing about that is you don't even need education. Because how long does it take, this is a great way to create jobs in Africa, right? Tourism. Because what do you need to be good in hospitality? You need a warm heart. You need to be able to smile at people when they walk into your hotel or your establishment. You need to know how to cook well, or to give people a massage, right? You don't need education for that. You just need some 2-week training course and you've got a job, right? So there's many skills, how to be a good waiter, right? To be able, so many great jobs that can be created without even formal education. And quick way to great jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So wildlife conservation is another big opportunity where we have this incredible asset that the rest of the world doesn't have, our unique biodiversity. And how do we actually leverage that to create employment and to drive our growth. So these are things where Africa is blessed, and there's no excuse for us not to be world class. So the one that I have spent a lot of my time thinking about is education, right? Because I think that if we can unlock the potential of our people, then that really makes all these other opportunities happen. Because our human capital, you need our best brains looking at these challenges and opportunities and working to bring them all to life. Now, I began working in this field sort of accidentally when I was growing up. My family's been involved in education for a couple of generations, but I never thought I would get into it. My grandmother started a school in Ghana. My mother started a school in Botswana. It started because she had a good track record as a teacher. And so many of the parents came to her and said, we want you to start a school. But the only problem is my dad had just passed away when I was 16. And my mother had 4 kids to look after. And so she says, I can't quit my job as a teacher and start a school. This is not the right time. And they kept saying, please, we'd like you to start a school. You really know education. So she says, okay, I'll start a small study group. And she started a group in a church, 5 kids, and 1 teacher. Then about a year later, it had grown to about 25 kids. By this time, I'd finished high school in Zimbabwe. I finished my A-levels. And so my mother said, okay, you're going to be the headmaster of the school. And she made me the headmaster at the age of 18. And I ran the school for a year. I taught the classes, I managed the teachers. And that's when I first got exposed to the power of education and how that school went on to become the top performing school in Botswana. Every year, for the last 18 years almost, it's number 1 or number 2 in the national exam in Botswana. So that's sort of how my first experience in developing education at world-class levels in Africa. I went off to college, I started my career, I worked in consulting for a couple of years. And then in 2004, I was thinking about all my experience of living and working in different parts of Africa and this whole question about education. And I thought, maybe there's something that I can do to actually catalyze this. But I decided to start first by educating leaders, because leadership in Africa is a very powerful force for change. And I thought, actually, I want to build a special school for creating Africa's future leaders. And that's what led me to start something called the African Leadership Academy, which is a special school in Johannesburg. You guys have seen that movie X-Men, where there's a special academy that trains these mutants? Yeah. So think about this as something like a special academy. And I'm Professor Xavier. He's also bald, right? And we would get the most outstanding young people from every country in Africa. They come to this boarding school for 2 years in Joburg. We train them as leaders and entrepreneurs. And then we send them off to top colleges around the world. So we've taken about 1,200 people through that program. We've invested about 1.5 billion rand into scholarships for these people. It's not my money that I raised from donors. It's been really exciting seeing what's happened to these exceptional young people who are being produced from this institution. But about 5 years ago, I started getting worried that we're producing all this talent and they had to leave Africa for college, right? Most of them come back, about 70% of them come back to Africa. But it didn't sit well with me that they had to go to Stanford and Yale and Oxford and Princeton and MIT. I said, we need our own versions of these universities, We need our own world-class institutions. But the problem is, how would you actually develop talent? Because remember, we don't have a lot of time when you have these constraints. You got no money. We're very poor on this continent. We don't have time. I mentioned we have less than 6,000 days before we have the largest workforce in the world. We don't have professors, right? It takes 15 years to produce one professor. And we've got massive demand. There's 20 to 30 million people graduating from high schools in Africa every year, and today universities can only take 2 million of them. So as I started looking at the issue of creating universities so that our kids from the academy wouldn't have to leave Africa, these are the constraints I was looking at. So when I looked at all this, I said, there's no way we can figure this out, right? Because to build an Oxford University, you need 900 years. That's how long they've been around. To build a Harvard, you need 400 years. But we've got 6,000 days, right? You need billions of dollars. We don't have any money. So I was like, oh, maybe someone else will figure this out in the next generation. But then something happened at this academy that showed me what was possible. We were teaching a computer science class, but the class wasn't going so well. So we decided, we're going to stop this class. But these kids came the next term and they said, we really want to do computer science. So we said, what do you want us to do? We don't have a teacher anymore. And so they kept insisting. We said, okay, fine, we'll try an experiment. We'll have you take an online class. But we didn't believe that online education alone would work, because one of our beliefs is that education is a social activity. People need to engage with each other and learn from each other. So we said, okay, you guys will come together as 14 students and you'll watch this course. It was a course on how to build a search engine. And we just left them. And so what happened is that they started watching these online course. And when they get to a point where one of them is confused, they'll pause the lecture. And the ones who get what's going on will explain it to the others. So soon they realized that because they had to explain the concepts to each other, it was forcing them to learn it a lot better themselves. Because if you have to explain something, it makes you really have to understand it, right? So soon these kids were learning how to code without a single teacher in the room. 6 months into the school year, I was sitting with one of our kids, and I said, what is your favorite classes at ALA this term? And she says, my computer science class. I said, how is that possible? There's no teacher in that class. She says, I'm learning more from that class, and I'm enjoying it more than any of my other classes. I said, how did you rate the class last year with the teacher? 6 out of 10. How did you rate the class now without a teacher? 9.5 out of 10. So I realized I've been thinking about this problem the wrong way. Instead of designing the university around a scarce resource, professors with PhDs, I needed to be thinking about designing it around an abundant resource, which is brilliant students. We have plenty of brilliant students. Make them the center of the learning. Have them teach themselves using all the curriculum that's now available from Harvard and Yale and Oxford and MIT online. But importantly, have them teach each other in the same space, right? And then they can still go to class, but much less frequently than a traditional university. And the person in the classroom doesn't have to be a professor with a PhD. It can be a mid-career professional, a retired executive, a recent college graduate. And they can then, their job is not to teach you the basics because you've got that online or from your peers. They're now helping you in a debate or a discussion, helping you think through how to apply to the real world and so forth. So that's the system of learning we developed. And with that, we said, okay, we now have a system that can actually move at the speed that we need to move to in Africa, because now you've removed the bottleneck to scale. We don't need professors anymore, right? We can open campuses very quickly because the students are abundant, and then the content is available. So with that, we set a new goal. The academy, when we started, we said we're going to train 6,000 leaders in 50 years. We now set a goal that we're going to develop 3 million leaders in 16 years with this university system. And that's the journey we started 4 years ago. Today, we've opened 4 campuses already. We have 1 in Mauritius, we have 2 in Rwanda, we have 1 in Kenya. And we now have reduced the time. It took us about 3 years to get the first site up. It took us 60 days to get the 4th site up. And now we can open them in a matter of 2 months. We can open a new site. So we're rolling this out all across Africa. Now, you might be wondering, how can this be high quality, right? You're producing so many leaders at such a speed, there's no way it can work. I want to show you how this model of learning works. A university without professors. And you tell me whether this model works and whether these kids you're going to see in this video can compete with anyone in the world. So watch this.
Arduino is a microcontroller. So what that means is it's this tiny computer that we can use to make it do anything for us in the real world. So for instance, I could take a bulb, connect it to my Arduino, connect that Arduino gadget to my computer, and then write code on the computer and tell my bulb, please light 1 time every 3 seconds. My bulb will now be lighting, dip, 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 and that's a functionality that you would not be able to get if you had just a battery and a bulb. But with an Arduino, you're able to now control things. You're able to control the physical world using code, which is pretty cool.
Arduino was first introduced to us in the third week of school. However, it was like 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and I hadn't felt like I had done something significant. And so I went to my facilitator, Zino, and I told him, I want to build something. I want to do something with what I'm learning. He mentioned we have a drone that uses Arduino, and he's like, I can assemble it and then fly it. And I was like, okay, yeah.
So Wango is my friend, and she knows I have this thing for programming, and I equally like Arduino. And so she came up to me and she said, Kathy, I have this quadcopter that we can program and tell to do things. We can teach it how to do many things. And so that completely fascinated me, and I was on board from the moment she told me. So we found ourselves in a room, fixing up everything and reading from a book, instructions back to back.
We had to assemble the drone. So it came in pieces, lots and lots of pieces. And then there are many parts, and we had to put the parts together. So there were like motors for the copter, and then it has a control board, which they call the flight board. And then what you connect to that is the Arduino, which you now connect to the computer so you can code.
Well, the fact that there was nothing, it was just a flow of pieces, and now you're able to bring it together and you see it fly. Something you created is now flying.
There is that relief, yeah. You feel like, yes, after all this we've gone through, we've actually made it work.
By doing this, the one thing for me personally that I gained was confidence. To hear that you built a quadcopter and you assembled microcontrollers, it sounds crazy, but then once you do it and once you're able to understand how the process goes, it automatically builds your confidence, and you're like, wait a minute. So this is what they're usually talking about. It's not that big of a deal, and it's not that hard at all. Anyone could do it.
So that campus that you see, that we set it up in 3 months, and you see how these girls are teaching each other, right? They were figuring out how to build this thing on their own, using technology and so forth. And they built one of the most sophisticated things, a drone, right? And they're 18-year-old girls, right? They can compete with the best in the world. And the even more remarkable thing about this is that we've been bringing the cost of this education down, right? So today we've brought it down to less than $2,000 a year. To go to Stanford today, you need $70,000. I went to Stanford. $70,000 a year. Harvard, Yale, it's all about that price. But yet when our kids, we send them out to internships. We said, let's see how employers compare them. So we said we'll test them only at the most rigorous employers. Every year they have to do a 4-month internship. So in the first year we send 3 to work for McKinsey, including 1 in Shanghai. We sent 3 to work for Bain, 7 to work for IBM, 2 went to work in Silicon Valley. We sent 1 to work in Paris at L'Oreal. And then at the end we said to the managers, tell us how these kids are performing compared to kids that you normally hire from Stanford and Yale and Oxford and Princeton. And they rated our kids 4.5 out of 5. Compared to those guys. And 97% of the managers asked for another intern. 5 of the kids were offered full-time jobs. They said, even though they were in first year, they're like, you're ready for work. You don't need to go for your second and third year. And that's what we're producing at $2,000 versus $70,000. So this, and we can rapidly roll this out. So this is what is possible in Africa, right? When you think differently. And so, as we look at education, I believe that education as we know it must evolve. Today, you have what I call just-in-case learning. It looks like this. You go and you sit in a classroom and you learn all kinds of facts and figures, just in case it becomes relevant to you someday. The problem is it never almost becomes relevant to you. What we need we believe, is what we call just-in-time learning, right? Because the world is changing so fast. You need constant just-in-time learning. So what does just-in-time learning look like? It has 3 characteristics. The first is that it starts but never ends. Because education used to be a one-shot game. You go to school for 4 years as an undergraduate, or maybe 2 years as a master's, and then that is supposed to last you for your whole life. The problem is the world is changing so fast that you need to keep learning. But there's no lifelong learning institution today. Well, we've created the first one. So we opened a university in Mauritius, we opened one in Rwanda. Now the thing we've opened in Kenya is not even a university. It's a lifelong learning center where you enter but you never graduate. Do you understand? So how does it work? You spend, for the first 3 years of your life, you're going through, so at the age of 18, you join this institution, and you might spend 8 months learning, and then 4 months in an internship for your first year. You do the same thing for your second year. You do the same thing for your third year, right? 8 months learning, 4 months at work. Then you go out and you start working in a more intense way. So now you flip to maybe 11 months of work and 1 month of learning. And then you keep coming back every year like that, right? Until the age of 45 or 60. You never graduate. Because maybe you start working and you realize, oh, I need to learn what digital marketing is. Because when I went to school, the first time, they didn't have Google. And I learned marketing in the world of billboards and TV. And now, 5 years later, we're living in a different world. So you go back and you get digital marketing skills. Now you need to learn what AI is, blockchain, all these fancy words that everyone's throwing about. You go to ALX, that's what we call it, and you keep learning, right? So it's just in time learning as you need it. You never graduate. You're always learning for your whole life. And you enter the institution, but you never leave. This is what the future of learning looks like. The second aspect about just-in-time learning is the focus of it is not about facts and figures. It's about learning how to learn, and more importantly, learning how to solve problems. How many of you, I want you to think back to your college, undergraduate, whatever you've studied. How many of you are in a job today that is exactly related to what you studied in college? I see like 6 people, 7 people, 8 people. Can someone tell me what they studied and what they're doing today? You studied tourism, and you're in tourism, wonderful. How many of you are doing something that's completely different? Yeah, this is always what happens when I try this test. The answer is never more than 10% of the people in the room who are doing something related to what they studied in college. Who's got a really radical example? What did you study?
Political science.
And what do you do now?
I run a safari company.
Another example?
I studied aerospace engineering.
Yeah.
And I run a safari company.
Aerospace engineering to a safari company. So this is how most people, their lives evolve. So what you study in college has nothing to do with what you do, especially because the world is changing so fast. Yet why today do you go to a college and then they give you a menu, which was created 50 years ago, that says Bachelor of Arts in History, Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, Bachelor of whatever, and they say pick from that menu. So one thing we've done at ALU is saying get rid of that menu. Rather, we give our students that list of the challenges and opportunities. And when we say don't declare major, but rather declare mission for your life. Pick one of those problems that you want to solve. And then you design your own learning experience around it. And you pick what courses online you're going to take. You design your own experiences. You shadow professionals in the field. You read books on the subject. You do prototypes. You do experiments. The aim of it is teaching you how to learn and learning how to solve problems, because problem solving will always be in fashion. Even when the robots come and they want to take your job, if you're a problem solver, you're always going to be relevant, right? And so the aim of this is learning how to learn so you can keep learning new skills as the world changes, and not about teaching you facts and figures, because we know that's not what you're going to do. So that's the second characteristic of just-in-time learning. And did you know that only 10% of skills that you acquire, all the research shows that only 10% of skills that you acquire is actually acquired in the classroom. Only 10%. 20% comes from your developmental relationships. So from your peers, from your mentors, from your manager. That's how you get the other 20%. 70% comes from experience. This is how we acquire skills. Yet, education only does this piece. 10% in the classroom. So, learning of the future needs to reflect this. And that's what we do as well in our institution. It's much more about giving you real hands-on experience, right? You learn leadership through leading. So our students run ventures on the campus. They go and they do all kinds of work experience. Like I mentioned, every year they spend 4 months in work and 8 months learning. They do self-directed learning. They interview experts. They do projects. This is how they learn. Because you're giving them experience, not just in the classroom. This is how you're going to prepare someone to actually get the 70% of the skills that they need. And so one of the things, for example, is we don't really care about grades. They get assessed by projects. What can they do? Because exams only tell you that you're good at following rules. They don't tell you actually, they don't demonstrate anything. And they rob you of feedback. Grades rob you of feedback. Grades rob you of learning because you just have a point. You don't know why you got a B or a C. You find out 3 months after the term is over. But rather what we should be doing is giving people feedback so that they can actually know how can they get better. Right? So this is how we think about learning. Now, how is this actually showing up? So I really believe that the future of learning is in Africa. 2016, 2 years after we started, not 300 years, not 900 years, we were called the Harvard of Africa by CNN. 2017, New York Times wrote an article about us, and they said this is one of 8 places in the world where history is being made. This year, Fast Company, they came up with a list of the 50 most innovative companies in the world. Alibaba was number 15 on that list. Apple was number 17. ALU was number 39 on the list in the world. It's not Harvard or Oxford or Yale, not UCT, I'm sorry, not MIT, not any of these famous universities we've heard of in the world. This is the only university in the world that was on the list of the most innovative companies in the world, right here in Africa. So I'm going to end by bringing it back to how this connects to all the work that you do in tourism and in travel. See, I believe that many of the world's problems and challenges are going to be solved in Africa in this century. What we have done in education, we've built the learning model of the future, not just for Africa, but for the whole world. 2 weeks ago, I'm going to say something, please do not repeat this or tweet this. I was invited to Necker Island. Do you guys know what Necker Island? It's Richard Branson's private island. So they invited about 30 of us to come and meet with Richard Branson and his daughter to talk about the future of learning. And they brought all these people from the US and Europe and so forth to come and talk about, where education is going and so forth. And I was, myself and another person were the only 2 from Africa. And they were all talking about, oh yeah, we need, lifelong learning, we need project-based learning, we need all these things. And they were just talking. But none of them had actually done anything. I was like, wait, all the stuff you guys are talking about, we've already done it. We have developed, and I realized that we were way ahead of all of them. All these, the world's best experts in learning, we were way ahead of all of them. Why? Because you see, they don't have any constraints where they're at. In the US, unemployment is 3%. In the Europe, it's 5%. They're like, yeah, we need all these things, but maybe 30 years from now. So all they are just talking, they're not actually doing anything because they don't have these constraints. We have a lot of constraints in Africa. We don't have time. We don't have money. So we have to completely reimagine everything. And therefore, we're going to bring together many of the problems in the world are going to be solved by Africans because of these constraints. So what we've done in education, you're going to see someone else doing healthcare, someone else doing in infrastructure, someone else doing in all these challenges. And then when we come up with the solutions here, we are actually going to export these innovations to the rest of the world. Right? So why does this matter to you? You know, when I travel, when you look about going to different places, when you go to Europe, you go to see the past, right? You're going to see those old museums and the castles and the, when it's very clear when you go to Europe that you're seeing a part of the world whose best has already happened, right? You're going to see history. And that's what people travel there to see, right? Even Japan, I was shocked. I went to Japan. I didn't see any young people in Japan. Because Japan today has a population of 126 million or something. It's aging at the fastest rate in the world. At the rate that they're going to have 26 million people in 100 years from now. Right? So the innovation isn't happening there. It's not. And Europe, same thing. You see a continent where where the best has already happened. Whereas when you come to Africa, and what do you see in Latin America? You go there for, food and salsa dancing, right? That's what their brand is. And what do you go to the US for? I don't know, Hollywood. But the point I'm making here is your brand as a travel company can never be bigger than the brand of the continent that you're selling. And so we need to really think about rebranding Africa and to show people that this is the continent of the future. This is where innovation and entrepreneurship and youth and all these ideas are going to change the world is happening here. So when someone goes to visit Zimbabwe, yes, they go and see the safari lodges and so forth that they have there. But they also should see the first country in the world that has gone completely electronic in its whole economy. Because there's no money in Zimbabwe, so they went straight to mobile money. So the entire country is run on mobile money. Literally 93% of the GDP in Zimbabwe is happening on mobile money now. That's an innovation. And why? Because they have constraints. Leapfrogged. Right? When they go to Kenya, they can go and see the safari lodges and climb Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro. But they should also see the place where mobile money was first created. Right? And when they come to different cities and they learn about, you take them to Vic Falls and they see all these things, also bring them to our campuses and they'll see the future of learning and see where the 21st century education and learning is happening, way ahead of what's happening in the rest of the world. Right? So, this scene, this is what we've been selling out of Africa, right? And this is what the world is. And yes, of course, people still want this, and yes, we need to keep selling this. But I want us to add to this notion that this is really where the future is being created. And there's a saying that was actually by someone called Pliny the Elder. Who knows who Pliny the Elder is? Who is he? An ancient Greek philosopher before Christ, whatever. He came up with this saying that's saying, out of Africa, always something new. This should be our motto for the rest of this century. Thank you.
I believe we've got a few minutes for some questions. Fred, is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure.
Sweet. There's a question over there. Would you like a mic, Bene, or are you?
No, I can shout.
Good.
I really would like to know where are the courses that you work with in universities, in your university, in your schools, where are they made? And who are they making?
Well, if you remember the slide I showed there.
I'm sorry, I came 5 minutes later, so maybe you already said it. I'm sorry. I arrived 5 minutes, you already started.
No, it's fine. I showed this much later in my presentation. You would have seen this. There's a slide I showed where I said only 10% of learning happens in the classroom.
Yes.
20% from your peers and your mentors and projects, 70% from experience. So when you look at that, It doesn't really, the 10%, you're focusing on the wrong part. The learning, the development of the skills that we're doing comes from all of that. Yes, we do have content, but you see, education used to be about learning facts and figures because we lived in a world where information was scarce. So you had to go to school to get it from the head of your professor or from a physical book in the library. That was what the world was like. Today, we live in a world where information is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Anything you want to know is on your phone. It's on the internet. The courses from all the Harvard professors, everything is online. So it's no longer about acquisition of facts and figures. That's not the purpose of education anymore. But most universities and schools are still stuck in the old era when information was scarce. You see what I mean? So what matters is learning how to learn so that you can use all the knowledge that's available on your fingertips. So they are using courses from the internet, and they can get into all the libraries around the world on their phone. It's not, education is not about sitting in a classroom and getting it from the professor anymore.
I'm asking this just because in Africa we have something that's called lobster and co. I don't know if you are...
In South Africa, where?
It's a South African company. And
Yeah.
actually they're doing courses online, which they're not online. It's something you can buy. And a lot of lodges and a lot of camps are using it since a few years now. And they are done particularly knowing that the people that are going to learn, it's especially making for the people that are going to learn. I mean, it's not something that was already there. They invented it because that part was missing. That part of the business was missing, like creating managers or whoever's working in a camp, like from mechanics. But the thing is that it was missing, and they had the idea to create it. So it was not something that was already there, and they invented it because it was necessary to do it. So that's why I was
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is that if they want that learning to be much more powerful, they need to go beyond just what they've trained for them. They need to think of this 10, 20, 70% thing. Those managers that they're trying to create for the safari industry and everything, they're going to develop them much better if they think about experiences and mentorship and projects that they do versus, so it's great that they've created that content, but they are tapping into only 10% of the potential. They need to think much more broadly to really have impact, right? So it's not enough to just give someone who runs a safari camp an online course. You need to actually have him run the camp. Give him, it's much more about the experience. That's how they're going to grow. And so we are not going to be focused too much on content creation because that's out there. Millions of people are producing that. It's already been produced. Knowledge is out there. Rather, let's learn how to use it and learn how to learn and get the experience and all those things. And that's how we're going to actually develop our skills.
Actually, Fred, we don't have any more time for questions, but I don't want to throw you under the bus, but I guess Fred will be hanging out here for a bit. If anyone wants to have a chat with him later and talk a little bit more, maybe.
Great. Thank you.
But thanks again, once more, Fred Swaniker, that was awesome.